Hey guys, welcome to another, in fact, probably our last class on shame. I talked last week about Paul and shame and 2020, and several of you had questions, and they were really, really good questions, asking me to clarify a few things or to explore a few more topics, and so that's what we're going to do tonight. But I'm going to give you a couple of warnings. First of all, as we go through this video, you need to realize that what I'm doing is I'm putting together snippets. They're not necessarily connected logical thoughts, but they're thoughts I have on shame. And so don't expect everything to flow one into another, but see each individual clip that you'll watch as unique segments. And then as we discuss after this video, we may tie together some of those snippets. The second thing is I've got several minutes of my drawing and writing, and it's not good, but hopefully it communicates the message. So I hope you enjoy tonight's class as we look a little bit deeper and a little bit more into Paul, his use of shame, and how that impacts us in 2020. So I want us to talk first of all about how shame would have functioned within Paul's culture. We're going to envision it as a house. And this is a two-story house. And there are the people who have honor, and these are the people who live on the top story of the house. And then in the culture, there are others who live on the bottom story of the house. And so in Paul's culture, it would have been the people on the top story, those with honor. They would be the rich. They would be the important that are there on the top. And in order to keep this kind of cultural separation going, those with honor would heap shame on those who were below them. And the function of that shame is again to maintain this type of social order. And so a person who was on the bottom of the house, the layer, they're going to see something very specific or in particular when they look in the mirror. And what they're going to see is that in themselves that I am worthless. As they look in the mirror, that's what they see reflected back at them. And so the result is exactly what that honor-shame culture wanted, which is this person who is in a lower class will stay put. That there's no reason for them to seek to be or to become anything because they are worthless. What happens when a person becomes a Christian in that culture? They still look in the mirror, but when they do, they see themselves as something valuable. And the reason is because what they see is a new creation. So they have an identity in Christ. And in light of that identity in Christ, they can do bad, but that's somehow separate from their identity because who they are is not what they've done. So what that means is that Paul will envision shame also like a house, but it's going to look very different than the shame of the culture. First thing that Paul is going to point out is that you are here. In other words, those who are in Christ belong on the top floor. That they have been elevated or lifted up into an honorable position because of what Christ has done. But if a person, though they belong on the top floor, that's their identity. If they live here, they live below who they're called to be, who in fact they are in Christ, then what Paul will do is he will use shame as a tool, or not simply to put them down, but as a tool to lift them up. So they are shamed because they are living less than what God has called them to live. They're living below their potential. So the function of shame then is to lift them up, not to push them down. And so that's why we see this goal of restoration. Going to run out of room there. But Paul wants them to be restored. And so the function of shame is restoration, to bring them back to the identity that they truly have in Christ. Now, why doesn't Paul just ignore it? If we can envision 3 circles, one that represents God, one that represents the self, one that represents the community. What we see is where honor comes from is God pours or bestows honor on the community and on individuals. He does that through the work on the cross. But because of that honor bestowed, there is a channel here that flows between each of these 3 entities. What is ideal that happens in these is honor, like glory and praise. It flows from the community, from the individual, and it flows back up to God. But the problem, and the reason that Paul has to intervene, is this thing of shame, shameful action, shameful conduct, connects these 3. And so if the community is shameful, that will then be reflected to God. People will see that God is no longer worthy or honorable, or shame will be put on his name. Or if I, as an individual, am acting or conducting myself in an inappropriate way, it's just not myself or even my community. This can go both ways. That can be impacted, but it's God. And so in those cases where shame is being brought upon God, Paul will encourage churches to exclude that individual in order to protect God's honor. But it's not just to protect God's honor, it's in order to bring this person back into an honorable position. So again, we see this redemptive function of shame. So we see different functions or uses of shame. If you have a group of people over here in the culture, and what they do is they exclude one person. They use shame as a tool to kind of push them away. What they're doing is they are putting this person down in order to lift themselves up. But what you see with shame in the New Testament, and as Paul uses it, the goal or the function of shame is to recognize that a person has been excluded by their conduct or behavior, but the attempt is to pull them back in. It's not an attempt to push them down in order to make a certain group come in, but it is an attempt to pull them back up to the level of the community of people. So when we talk about shame, if we're thinking about the sense that shame is making someone feel like they are bad, or they are worthless, or they are fundamentally flawed, that's never a form of shame that Paul utilizes, and it's not a form of shame that we can utilize. But when Paul does shame, he's often doing something very different. 1 Corinthians 6:5, I say this to your shame. Paul is not saying you need to realize that you're a really, really bad person. But as he talks about the lawsuits amongst unbelievers, he is saying that there should be people who are capable and competent to do it. He shames them because they are not living up to their Christian possibility and potential. And so what Paul is doing there is he's trying to draw them higher to realize they're going to judge the angels. And if they cannot judge in these lesser things, that they're acting in a way that is inconsistent with their identity. So Paul's not trying to push them down or say you should feel terrible about yourself. Instead, what Paul is doing is he's trying to lift them up and to say, stand up to the level to which you have been called. One of the keys for Paul has always been identity in Christ. Look at how he starts the letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 1:2. To the church of God that is in Corinth, to those who are sanctified in Christ Jesus, called to be saints. And if you've read very much of 1 Corinthians, you're going to get pretty quickly the idea that the saints might be hard to find. And yet Paul calls them as the identity they are saints. In fact, I like what Ralph Winter says. He says, Paul does not state that they should be sanctified or that they will be sanctified in heaven, but that they are already sanctified. So the foundation of everything that Paul does is identity in Christ. And the foundation of anything that we do with shame also needs to have that same foundation. If any shame is about attacking someone's identity, putting down someone's identity, then it's going to be misplaced shame. It's not going to be functional in a gospel way. Let's think about this from the context of the national campaign to prevent teen pregnancy. They have a series of images and of posters that they put up. Across one girl, they wrote the word cheap. Across a young man, the word useless. A girl, nobody. Another, dirty. And all of these were to be words that would deter teen pregnancy. But the problem with these words is they are words of identity. That they make people who get pregnant as teens feel like they should feel those things. Whereas the reality is one can be in Christ, guilty of this sin, and not needing to be subject to a kind of shame that makes them feel like they are now worthless. And I guess that just leaves one last question, which is, does shame work? I think that really just depends on the nature of the kind of communities that we have. Do we trust and realize that people recognize our identity in Christ? That they have our best interest in heart? That through their action and contact, they're actually trying to help us to renew and restore our relationship with Christ? If those elements aren't there, I think that anything that brings shame on someone will likely not lead to some sort of a lasting impact. But if it is there, if it is present, there is possibility. And so I don't think we throw out the baby with the bathwater, but maybe we need to have a better idea of what it means to embrace shame in a way that can be redemptive in our lives. And so once again, like we did last week, we're going to be having a discussion on Facebook Live in just a couple of minutes. And so I want to encourage you to come over there as we continue to explore this topic of Paul and of shame and of our actions and responsibility in the church today.